This video will cover subtopic 1.1, an introduction to cells. This is just an outline of what we will cover in this video, so we'll cover all the expectations of 1.1, except for anything related to stem cells. But that will be covered in a separate video. So we'll start with cells. Cells are the fundamental building blocks of all living organisms. The smallest organisms are unicellular, meaning that they are one cell. And the largest organisms are multicellular, meaning that they are made up of many cells. Cells will vary in size and shape, but they all share common features. Every cell is surrounded by a membrane. Every cell contains genetic material. Cell activities, such as cell movement and cell reproduction, for example, are controlled by chemical reactions which are catalyzed by enzymes produced inside of the cell. So these activities are basically controlled or moved along by these protein molecules that are created by the cell. And cells have their own energy release system that powers all the cell's activities. So cells have their own way of taking a molecule, releasing energy from it, and using that to drive or power all of its activities. With all these shared features to cells, this goes into making up the cell theory. And the cell theory has three parts to it. First part is that all living organisms are made up of cells. For anything to be classified as living, it has to be composed of cells. If it's not made of cells, then it's not classified as alive. Cells are the basic unit of life, so the smallest unit of life is going to be a cell. There is nothing smaller that it would be considered alive. And cells only come from pre-existing cells. So cells do not just appear out of thin air or appear spontaneously. Cells are created from other cells or from cells that currently exist. So with the first point of cell theory, all living things are made of cells. So when living things are observed under a microscope, they appear to be composed of cells. And in fact, it was a scientist by the name of Hooke who observed cork under a primitive microscope that first noted that this cork, this tree, was made up of these chambers, or what he called cells, and hence the term cell. However, there are a number of examples of cells that do not conform to the standard notion of what a cell looks like at the microscopic level. This is a typical example of how variation in biological systems means that these biological theories are really based on concepts or regularities, patterns that are generally observed. However, there do exist these discrepancies to these concepts or to these theories. And these discrepancies are going to be exceptions to that general trend, things that do not fit that traditional mold. The examples that Ivy would like you to know about the exceptions to cell theory include striated muscle cells. So striated muscle cells are found in that muscle that you find connected to your bone. So that is the muscle that is used to change the position of our body. And that muscle is made up of a smaller group of tissue called muscle bundles. And in those muscle bundles, this is made up of muscle fiber. Muscle fiber is going to be the cell, or a cell, one single cell. And the reason why it's called striated muscle, or striated cell, is that when viewed under a microscope, you can see these striations at regular intervals all along the length of the cell. So they're striated muscle cells. These striated muscle cells do coincide with cell theory in that they do contain a cell membrane. They are formed from the division of pre-existing cells, They contain genetic material, and of course they have an energy release system. Where they differ from cell theory or do not align with what you typically see in a cell is that they are much larger than most animal cells. In fact, like a typical animal cell is about 0.03 millimeters in size, or if you want, about 30 nanometers in size. And striated muscle cells are also multinucleated, meaning that they have many nuclei, whereas a typical cell would only have one nucleus. If you have a look at the purple picture here, outlined in green is going to be one muscle fiber, or one muscle cell. And the little purple dots here are going to be the nuclei, or a nucleus, sorry. And so you can see that within this one cell, there are many nuclei, whereas a typical cell would only have one. Another exception to the rule are fungal hyphae. Fungi consist of narrow thread-like structures called hyphae. This tubular system of hyphae form a dense network referred to as the mycelium. So what you see here, so this is the hyphae here. So this is the hyphae. And these hyphae form these multiple tubular networks referred to as the mycelium. So when they're all kind of spread about and intertwined, they form that mycelium. So these fungal hyphae coincide with cell theory in that they have a cell membrane. They have a cell membrane, something that goes around the cell, and they do have a cell wall. Where they differ from cell theory is that each hyphae is a multinucleated, large tube-like structure that contains many nuclei. So each hyphae is going to be an individual cell, and they are very long cells. And they have a nucleus, they have nuclei that runs throughout the entire length of that hyphae. And the cytoplasm is continuous along the hyphae with no end cell wall or membrane. So they have really this continuous cytoplasm that runs the entire length of the hyphae. Another exception to the rule are algae. Algae feed themselves by photosynthesis. They are simpler in structure and organization than plants, and most are small and consist of one cell. They differ from cell theory, or where some of them can differ from cell theory, is that you can get giant algae that can grow to a length of 100 millimeters. And despite this size, they only have one nucleus. So they have this really big cell with this one nucleus in there. And so that length of 100 millimeters, you know, if we talk about the fact that a typical animal cell is going to be 0.03 millimeters in length, you know, this is considered one giant cell. So moving on to the second part of cell theory. So cells are the smallest unit of life. So the cell is the smallest unit of organization that can actually show the characteristics of living processes. Organelles often require the cooperation of other organelles for their successful function. So individual organelles are not considered alive or living. An interesting example is the mitochondria, which can replicate and carry out metabolism, its own metabolism. However, the mitochondria needs metabolic products from the cytoplasm within the cell in order to begin its respiratory processes or its process of creating energy. So the mitochondria itself here cannot function on its own. It needs products from the cytoplasm in order to function. In the third part of cell theory, where cells come from pre-existing cells, so cells will carry out a form of cell division to form new cells. This process of cellular replication in eukaryotes is referred to as mitosis, which will be covered separately. And in prokaryotes, this process is referred to as binary fission. The parental cell will divide to produce identical daughter cells. And this is the end result of cell division. You are producing an identical daughter cell. This aspect of cell theory suggests that all cells therefore have a common ancestor, the original ancestral cell from which all other cells have arisen by descent. So, there was one kind of common cell at some point that eventually gave rise to all cells that exist today. This relationship of common ancestor therefore suggests that all organisms are related. And as we go through the course, we will see that there are a number of commonalities between all organisms. So now, given that organisms are composed of cells, they can be lumped into two large categories, either being unicellular or multicellular. So if an organism only consists of one cell, it is considered unicellular, and that one cell then must carry out all the functions of life. That one cell has to do everything that is needed in order for that one cell to exist. So unicellular organisms must carry out a process of absorbing organic matter or synthesizing organic molecules in the form of nutrition. They have to be able to carry out cellular respiration to release ATP or energy. This process is metabolism. They have to be able to grow and increase in size. And then, of course, because there are going to be changes in their environment, that cell has to be able to respond to those changes and react appropriately to them. Because the cell is carrying out chemical reactions, it is going to generate waste products, and it has to have a means of getting rid of those waste products. Because of the changing environment that this unicellular organism will exist in, it has to have a means of maintenance and regulation of internal cell conditions. As it responds to those to those environmental changes, it has to have a means of regulating the conditions within the cell itself. This process is referred to as homeostasis. And then that unicellular organism has to be able to reproduce. And because it's unicellular, this will usually be through asexual cell division to essentially form a clone. So a unicellular organism has to be able to carry out all of these processes in order to survive. Now, when we deal with multicellular organisms, they do consist of a singular mass of cells that are fused together. One of the most intensively researched multicellular organisms is the nematode C. elegans, which is this kind of squiggly gray thing here. The adult body is 1 millimeter long and is made up of exactly 959 cells. The fact that researchers know that it's made up of this many cells, or this exact number of cells, allows it to study what each of those cells do. By removing cells, it can see how the organism adapts to different conditions, and can even give a sense of, they can also study how those cells function together for the organism. The benefit of having, the benefit to multicellular organisms is that there can be a division of labor among all those requirements for survival. So with multicellular organisms, if you have identical cells in a group that organize themselves and interact with each other to form a living organism with distinctive overall properties. So you have all these cells that will organize themselves, will group themselves, and then interact with each other. So multicellular organisms show what's referred to as emergent properties. So the example of this is that cells form tissues, tissues form organs, organs form organ systems, and organ systems form multicellular organisms. Basically, what emergent properties are getting at is that the whole is greater than the composition of its parts. So, for example, your lungs are made up of many cells. However, those cells by themselves aren't going to be very much use. It is the many cells working as a unit that allow the lungs to perform their function. So those cells in your lung, if they were try to survive on their own, they would not be able to. It is the group of cells working together that allow for their survival and that show those properties of a lung. So within multicellular organisms, since you have different cells performing different roles, cells need to differentiate from each other or differentiate to carry out those specific roles. So when we talk about cell differentiation, we're talking about the fact that cells do perform these different functions. So for example, red blood cells will carry oxygen, retinal cells will absorb light and then transmit those impulses to the brain. Often a group of cells specialize in the same way to perform the same function, and in this case, when they work together, we refer to that as tissue. So with this process of cell differentiation, cells that become specialized to carry out their role, more efficiently than if they had many different roles. So a cell will carry out one specific role within that multicellular organism rather than trying to perform many different roles. In humans, we have anywhere between 220 to 230 distinct, highly specialized cell types. So these cell types can include things like nerve cells and liver cells, or blood cells, or cardiac cells. And all of these different cell types originate from one progenitor cell, referred to as stem cells. So with these differentiated cells now, they will express different genes. So there are many different cell types, but they all have the same set of genes. So what is a gene? So we can think of it as segments of DNA that codes for a protein. That protein will have a very specific role within the cell. So even though we have many different cell types, they all have the same set of genes. They all have the same segments of DNA that will code for all of these different proteins. So cells do not just have genes with the instructions that they need. They have genes needed to specialize in every possible way. So every cell contains DNA to become any other cell, essentially, or would have the DNA that any other cell could use. So all cells have the same DNA, they just access different parts of the DNA to perform their different roles. There are approximately 25,000 genes in the human genome within that human DNA sequence, and these are present in all body cells. In most cell types, less than half of the genes will be needed or used. So when a cell differentiates, it doesn't use all of the DNA in its nucleus. It only uses a small part of the DNA. So when a gene is being used by a cell, we say that the gene is expressed. So when a gene is being used to create protein, we say that it is being expressed. The gene is considered switched on, and the information then is used to make a protein, as I said. So when cells develop, certain genes need to be switched on, and others need to be switched off. So some parts of the DNA are not accessed, while other parts are, and you get expression of some proteins, but not others. Cell differentiation happens because a different sequence of genes is expressed in different cell types. So the control of gene expression is the key to development and differentiation of these different types of cells. So that does it for this video. We'll continue on a different day dealing with stem cells.